Well, yes, of course you should. Today, I wanted to look at whether you should still be considering a Sony A7 IV in 2023. Is it still the camera that I would recommend most people go out and buy for their professional shoots? Or is it something that should be avoided now there's plenty of other options in a similar price bracket? Let's start off with the cheaper options. Maybe you don't need to actually spend all the money on an A7 IV when you could go for another camera instead and then spend a bit more on lenses and accessories. Well, the first option would be the classic Blackmagic Pocket 4K. Now this camera is getting quite old now, but the quality is still amazing, so I can totally see why people would still be tempted by it. That said, I think just the battery life and the ergonomics of using the camera is getting to the point now that it's just getting a bit too frustrating. I think you can definitely get just as good results out of the A7 IV. It may take a bit more effort in terms of color grading. You may have to be a bit more careful in terms of not overexposing the image and obviously not having features like false color. But overall, I think for most people, it's going to be a much more enjoyable experience going with the A7 IV. In a similar price bracket and a much newer camera is of course the new R7 from Canon. And this is an intriguing camera that even I was tempted to pick up as a B camera to RC70. The only problem is though, it definitely has limited dynamic range compared to the Sonys, as well as it obviously being a crop sensor rather than full frame. Now, the fact that it is a crop sensor isn't a big deal when it comes to video. After all, Super 35 has been the standard for years and it will still be a standard for many more years to come. However, once you've had full frame, especially for photography, it's really hard to go back. It just makes lens choice, I think, a lot more simple than when you're using a crop sensor. You could make the R7 full frame by just picking up a speed booster. However, once you start adding that up, the cost does start getting very close to the A7 IV. The Canons still do have their IBIS issues as well with the wobble, which doesn't seem to be present in the Sony, which is much more subtle when it comes to its image stabilization. I would though consider the R7 as the cheapest Pro option out there. It would be the cheapest camera I think in 2023 that I would actually pick up. The Panasonic GH6 is a brilliant camera with some really unique features like open gate where you can use the entire sensor, so it's brilliant for social media when you want to crop different aspect ratios. However, it is still just micro four thirds, a lot smaller sensor, and sensor size isn't everything, but I think as time goes on, it's starting to get a little bit old. Micro four thirds is definitely dying out. If you already have lots of micro four third lenses, then maybe it's worth picking up a GH6. But if you're starting from scratch, it's not something that I go for. Also, Panasonic are really lacking with the autofocus still. And once again, although it's not really vital in every single shoot, it's certainly useful to have. I think for interviews nowadays, you may as well use autofocus. It's going to do a better job than you could ever do manual focusing. Now, many out there may argue that the FX30 in a similar price bracket is a better choice than the Sony A7 IV. Both coming from Sony, pretty much all identical features, but you're getting that really nice body of the FX3 in a more affordable package. And in some ways, there are massive similarities. After all, if you shoot 4K 60 on the A7 IV, you're going to have a crop sensor, a similar size sensor to what you get on the FX30. So there's no real differences there. However, there definitely is differences in terms of the image quality and the dynamic range between the cameras, and that's something that has put me off a little bit with the FX30. I also really like having a viewfinder on my cameras, so another reason why I personally would probably pick the A7 IV. That said, I think for a lot of people who do a lot of long form filming, so maybe they're shooting events, for example, perhaps weddings, there could be a good reason to go for the FX30 because of that built-in fan. Knowing for sure that the camera is not going to overheat could be a big deal to go for the FX30 over the A7 IV. I've not really had any issues with overheating on the A7 IV, except one time where it did start warning me about the camera getting too warm, but generally when you're shooting lots of quick corporate work, it's not a problem. That said, if you need to know for sure that there's no way that the camera is going to overheat, then the FX30 might be a better choice in the price bracket. Even if you can live without the viewfinder and full frame sensor, the other issue with the FX30 is the fact it really isn't designed to take photographs. They haven't put a mechanical shutter in there. It can only take one photo at a time. There's no burst mode or anything like that. So it very much is a video camera through and through, much more so than even the FX3 was. And that could be fine if that's all you do, but I think if you do any sort of hybrid work, if you have any reason to be doing a mix of work, then the A7 IV is the way to go. So they are the cheaper cameras, but what about the direct competition, the cameras that are pretty much the same price as the A7 IV? Well, first off is the new Canon R6 Mark II, and it's got some really nice improvements that I do think makes it a much bigger challenger to the A7 IV than what the original R6 was. The biggest problem with Canon is they still suffer from the same issues like the R7 suffers from and like the R5 also suffers from. You know, a limited dynamic range because you don't get to use C-Log2. A lot of the codecs and everything are simplified as well. You don't have as many options there. So if you're not editing on a new M1 Mac, you may struggle actually with the files as well. I think the biggest problem though with Canon right now is the fact there's no third-party lens support. When you compare the lens options for Canon with Sony now, Sony are far ahead. Yes, of course, you can go out and buy EF lenses, and they are still great, and there's plenty of second-hand options out there. And if you have a big selection of EF lenses already, then the R6 could make a lot of sense. However, if you're starting from scratch, personally, I think I'd rather go with E-mount instead. There's just such a good selection from all the various manufacturers, whether it is from Sony, Sigma, or Tamron. There are so many great options that I just think it's a much better way to go. The other camera that I think really does directly compete with the A7 IV is the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro and also the Pocket 6K G2 as well, if you don't need those ND filters. Now, I've actually done videos where I compare the two of these cameras, and there's a lot of pros and cons going with either one. And obviously, I think probably one of the biggest reasons why you go for the Pocket 6K Pro, other than B-RAW of course, is the fact it has built-in ND filters, and that is a big deal for a lot of people, and it makes it a much more appropriate cinematic camera. I also love the massive screen on the back of the Pocket 6K Pro as well, and the battery life is a lot better than it was in the past. That said, there are features of the A7 IV that I just think you would sorely miss if you were to pick up a Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro for most sort of corporate work out there. Things like autofocus, things like the stabilized sensor, having a full frame sensor are all big advantage. Having the ability to photography as well is another big reason why the A7 IV wins. That combined with the much better battery life are all good reasons why probably I would go for the A7 IV. The final thing we should consider then is, should you spend a bit more? Should you go up to an A7S III, an FX3, a R5 or R5C, or even a C70 or even FX6 if you're going down the cinema camera route? I think the A7 IV is really the tipping point where we see the advantages of spending more actually has diminishing returns. You look at those much more expensive cameras, and yes, they are slightly better in various areas and certain features and buttons and all these little things that just slightly improve the cameras, but in terms of overall image quality that your audience or your client is actually going to notice, not really. And in some facts, actually, maybe the A7 IV is actually better. I think for most people starting out with the A7 IV and then maybe considering upgrading to one of those other cameras in the future is probably the best route to take, rather than jumping straight up to the more expensive cameras. So there you go, they are my opinions on the A7 IV and the competition going into 2023. I'd love to know what you think. Which cameras should people pick up? For me, the A7 IV still ticks so many boxes. The image quality is amazing, it takes great photos, I love how easy it is to switch back and forth, I love the lens options you have, the battery life is great, the stabilization is more than good enough, even if it's not as good as say Panasonic. You've got great colors, 4K 60 and really nice robust codecs. Now, of course, there are things you'd like to see improved on the A7 IV and some things that other manufacturers are offering in a similar price bracket. But overall, I think the A7 IV is the best option for most people. If you've enjoyed this video, then make sure you check out some more videos where I've talked about the A7 IV, whether it's addressing its rolling shutter issue or whether you actually need to shoot 4K at all. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.